Hello everyone and welcome back to another video, and in this lesson we'll take the task manager application we built earlier and enhance it by focusing on template driven forms with form validation. Template driven forms are simple and straightforward, making them a great fit for small applications. So what we're going to do is we're going to add validations using Angular's built-in validators. We're going to display validation error messages and also using ngModel with form controls. So let's go back to Visual Studio Code and let's start coding. And let's open task list HTML, and we need to do a form here. So under the H3, let's create a new form, and we need to move our button and our input inside the form. Next, what we need to do is set a local reference to the form and assign it to a variable called task form. And this task form will equal to ngForm. ngForm is a directive provided by Angular that tracks the state of the entire form, such as whether it is valid, invalid, touched, and so on. Hashtag task form. This is like a way of creating a short alias that we can use to refer to the form inside the template. Now let's add ngSubmit that we will bind to our addTask method, and we will provide the task form variable reference that we created as an argument to our addTask method. And as you can see, we have an error here, expected 0 arguments but got 1, and we will fix that in a minute. So what we did here is this binds the submit event of the form to a function in our component addTask, and when the user submits the form by pressing the addTask button, this method is called. So ngSubmit, basically this is an Angular event binding that listens for when the form is submitted. It triggers the function inside the parentheses when the submit button is clicked. And then we are calling the addTask method in the component and passing the form reference task form to it. Inside the addTask function, we can now access the form's validity and some other properties. Now let's do one more thing to the form and add no validity. What this does is tells the browser not to use its default HTML5 validation. Instead, we want Angular to manage the form validation process. Without no validate, modern browsers might display their own error messages for the required fields or other validation rules. So why disable browser validation? Well, Angular gives us more control over how validation messages are shown, and we can also style out and structure validation messages according to our design. So the browser's built-in validation, like showing messages in small tooltips, may not fit well with the overall user experience we want. Now, first, let's do a little formatting here to make the input more readable. So then we're going to modify the input by setting it to required, and also setting a minimum length of 3 characters, as well as adding a new variable on the fly, which we'll call task input, and we will set it equal to ngModel. Also, let's not forget to put the name, which will be task name. Next, we need to add some validation for the modifications we did on the input field. We need to handle the task name is required and the minimum length of characters required in order for the task name to be valid. So right below the form group, let's add a new div container that use ngIf again. And let's do a condition of task input dot invalid, double end, and task input dot touched. So this diff will show only if both conditions are met, when the form is invalid and the input is touched. The task input field, task input, is invalid, meaning it doesn't meet the validation rules and the field has been touched when that's basically when the user has interacted with it. Then we are going to add a new paragraph inside the div container and use ngIf again. And let's set a condition of task input dot error. And here we are going to use the optional chaining operator in JavaScript and in TypeScript, represented by the question mark. It allows you to safely access properties of an object that might be null or undefined without having to explicitly check for those cases. And using the optional chaining operator is like a safety net in case we get null or undefined, which in some cases it can result in error or even the application can stop working. So simply put, it can result in unwanted behavior. Then we need to access the required property, and now we have an error here. Property required comes from an index signature, so let's fix that. Now let's type the message that we want to display when this condition is met, which is task name is required. Then we need to add another paragraph that will handle the task minimum length. So we will use ngIf once again, and we will set a condition of task input to errors, use the optional chaining operator again, and access the minimum length property, which gave us an error again. So let's do the same and fix it. And last thing, type the minimum length message error we want to display. Next thing we need to do is let's modify the button. We don't need the click event anymore, so let's remove it. Instead, we will set the button type to submit. So when the user clicks this button, it will execute the form. Last thing we need to do to the button is add a validation by setting the button property disabled to taskForm.invalid. Basically what this does is if the form is not valid, the button will be disabled and the user will not be able to submit any tasks until the form is valid. Next, let's switch over to our logic and modify the addTask method. Now remember, we had an error in the template when passing the form references as an argument. Well, we'll fix that error now by defining it in our addTask function, and let's make it of type any for now. Also, instead of trimming the new task like we did before, let's use the taskForm.valid as a condition. Also, we are going to use the provided task form and reset the form as well. And let's create a comment. It's always a good practice. And finally, let's do ngServe and start our development server. And let's check the application in the browser. Now, right away, I can see an issue with the buttons. So let's fix that. Let's move the toggle button right below the add task button. And now it looks good. Now let's do a quick test. Toggle button is working. Add task is now not doing anything, which is correct behavior. And now let's type something in the input and add a new task. Working good. Let's check the validations. First, minimum length. But I don't like how the error is displayed here, so let's fix that. Let's add some bootstrap classes to our paragraphs, like text danger and margin top. Let's now copy the the classes, and let's apply them to the second paragraph to be the same. Last thing, let's move the error messages right below the input, and then we can go back to the browser and check again. Yeah, everything looks good, much better. So from the top, we added a form tag around our task input and bound it to a local variable, task form, using hashtag task form equals ngForm. This form object contains metadata about the form's validity, which we can use to control the form's behavior. NoValidate disables the browser native form validation, so Angular can handle validation. The form control input is bound to the new task property using ngModel with validators like required and minimum length. Required ensures that the field is not empty. Minimum length equals to 3 ensures that the task name has a minimum length of 3 characters. By adding hashtag task input equals ngModel, we can access the validation status of the input field. This lets us control the display of error messages based on the state of the field. Then we use ngIf directives to display the error messages conditionally. We also disable the submit button if the form is invalid. So what we did in this lesson is basically learn about template-driven forms and how to manage form control validation using built-in directives like required and minimum length. Also how to display validation error messages conditionally based on form field status. Disabling form submission until all validation criteria are met. So key Angular concepts that we used in this lesson are ngForm, which handles the form's state of validation, ngModel, which handles two-way data binding between the input field and the component, validation directives like required minimum length, which help enforce form validation rules directly in the template. In the next lesson, we will refactor this task manager to use reactive forms instead of template-driven forms. Reactive forms provide more control over form validation and are better suited for complex, large-scale applications. So that's it for this video. See you in the next one.